The conversation around suicide is never an easy one, but the conversation around suicide is necessary. And that's why I am so glad to have someone that I now call my friend, Erin Blechman, with us today to talk about her experience, to give us the advice that she used to help her survive the loss and suicide of her son, Max. So stay tuned. This is going to be a phenomenal podcast. You are going to love all the things that she shares with you. This is definitely a conversation around grief, loss, mental illness that absolutely needs to be had. Welcome to the Grief Inspired podcast. I am so excited to introduce you to someone today that I actually met, if you believe it, a friend of a friend on Facebook. I happened to be looking at one of my friends' Facebook page, and there was Erin Blechman and her story and talking about the book that she had just released that's called My Unexpected Journey: Reflections After Losing My Son to Suicide. And I thought the conversation around suicide is so critically important that I immediately jumped on the phone and I said, Erin, we have to talk. I need to know more about this. So, Erin, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh gosh, thank you for having me. I'm thrilled. I'm thrilled to be able to
Yes,
talk to
and
you and your audience.
yes, and as part of doing this, I read your book and I just have to say it is phenomenal. It is a must read for anyone who is grieving at all, or someone who has either lost someone to suicide, or has a friend that lost someone to suicide, or if you are a clinician who is working with people who are grieving. There is just so much good information in here that's so relatable, so real, so vulnerable. I can't say enough good things about it. So thank you so much.
Following Max's death, and it's laid out chronologically in sections. And so it's really helpful to kind of see, it's almost a guideline of what those first, that first year and a half of grief is really like. The shock and the numbness and the anger and the depression and the crisis of faith. And so I just really wanted to put that out there because I thought that it would have helped me to read something like that after losing him. And so I wanted to help others. And so it was released initially in April of 2022. And then I re-released it this past September for Suicide Prevention Month with a new 4-year later section. And that 4-year later section has chapters from my husband, Bill, my other son, Sam, and Sam's wife, Julia. And so I think really gives an interesting perspective. We all lost the same person, but the way that we dealt with it and handled it is completely different. So I think that it just gives readers another perspective on grief. So that's a little bit about
Yeah. Yeah, and I love that. And you talk so much about how it showed up for you as a mother.
it.
And I love that. And I love how you talk so much about the mental illness that Max suffered and how your grief gave you insight into what he was going through and what he must have experienced, which you had no idea, even though you were his mother and very close to him, as you always were. So tell us about Max.
Oh my gosh, I could talk about him for hours. He was the most interesting person I've ever known. And I don't just say that because I'm his mom. Really. As a little guy, he was just quirky, eccentric, funny. He started speaking in full sentences at 15 months. He read his first Harry Potter book between kindergarten and first grade. He
Oh,
really just had a brilliant, beautiful mind. There was one summer, actually, it was the summer I was pregnant with Sam. He was almost 3, and he wore shorts and snow boots the whole summer. That kind of gives you a glimpse of what he was like as a little guy. Very sensitive, very tenderhearted. And he remained that way throughout his life. He was also very creative. He wrote poetry and short stories and songs. He was a musician. He played the drums and he taught himself to play the banjo. He was in multiple bands throughout his life. He published a magazine when he was in high school that featured local artists in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. And so he did stand-up comedy. He then wrote his own material for that. And so he was just a really creative, interesting, intelligent guy. The other thing I love about him and makes me so proud to be his mom is he was an activist. And he used his voice to, on behalf of others. He was deeply impacted by social injustice and inequity. And he used his privilege to kind of call that out. And that makes me so proud as his mom. He was a special person, and frankly, he was too special for this world. And
Mm.
the world really is missing out on the fact that he's no longer here. Obviously I am as his mom, we are as his family, but I think the world in general is missing out because Max is no longer in it.
Well, it sounds like that because from reading your book and learning so much about him, yeah, I would have loved to have known him and how amazing he was. And it sounds like he already, in the 25 years that 25, right? He was
Mhm.
25. That he did have a significant impact. So you mentioned in the book that he, suffered from mental illness. When did that start to surface for him?
Well, when I look back, I can see signs of it from the time he was a little boy. This just as an example, as a baby, I would try to play lullabies and he would cry harder. So he was like impacted by that melancholy, sad music. And then when he was a little boy, his reactions to things were always sort of bigger and more magnified than the rest of ours. And as an example, I've used this many times. We had a little Karen Terrier puppy that we got when he was 7, and Sam, no, that's not right. He was 10, I think, and Sam was 7. Anyway, she was a feisty thing. And we had an electric fence that she escaped all the time. So we live in a wooded area, but it's adjacent to a busy suburbia. And so when she would get lost, we would go looking for her. And, Sam and I would be calling her name and combing the woods. And Max's level of apprehension and sadness was just so much greater than ours. And so I see signs of his depression and anxiety way back then. But then it manifested itself in high school with some physical ailments. He had a lot of gastrointestinal issues that we had every test known to man done, and they could never find a cause. So, looking back, that was the anxiety, really the start of the serious anxiety. And then when he went away to college, that was his first episode of suicide ideation, for which he needed to be hospitalized. And then he was hospitalized probably 5 times throughout his life for suicide ideation. So he really struggled with that deep depression and anxiety. And, it just ultimately proved too much for him. He couldn't live with it anymore. And it was just a darkness that he couldn't escape from. And, as his mom, to watch him struggle and suffer was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And he was diagnosed officially with major depressive disorder right around his 19th birthday. And then a year later, he started to have seizures just out of the blue. And so he was diagnosed with epilepsy. And both of those diagnoses and illnesses were serious blows to him, to his self-confidence, to his independence. When he started to have seizures, he lost his license. And so, he lost a lot of that autonomy and independence that he had had previously. And that was just very difficult for him to accept and to navigate. So yeah, it was a journey. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, yeah. And so, in talking about mental illness and suicide, so many people they don't talk about it. They don't really understand. I mean, even you said, you didn't completely understand the magnitude of what he was going through. How did that show up for you in terms of your level of understanding as you started to grieve him?
Well, when he was alive, he lived on his own. He didn't live with us for the majority of the time that he was really struggling and sick. But when he would have a depressive episode, a lot of times he would come home for a few days. And having him lay in his bed was, I just couldn't take it. So a lot of times I would go in there and drag him out of bed and drag him on a walk or drag him to Target or, something. And I didn't realize that he didn't need me to do that. He didn't want me to do that. He wanted me to come alongside him in his depression. And one of his therapists told us that. She said, he doesn't want, when he's in a depressive episode, he doesn't want you to pull him out of the pit. He wants you to get in the pit with him. And she didn't mean that she wanted us to also be depressed. She just meant that he wanted us to come alongside him and comfort him and witness his pain. And I was constantly trying to talk him out of it, pull him out of it. And, that's a regret I have. I have to live with that for the rest of my life. And when he died and I struggled with depression myself and I couldn't get out of bed, it made me, it made that regret even bigger. And, and just made me think, would help me understand what he was going through and just made me think, oh, my poor boy, he probably felt like I didn't see him or understand him at all. And, so I'm not, well, in a way, I'm grateful for that time because it did open my eyes in a way that I don't know they ever would have been open before. And so, we think in our culture, the opposite of depression is happiness, and it's not, it's motivation. And so if you think about it from that standpoint, it's not that the person doesn't want to get out of bed, they literally can't. And
Right.
I
And
think,
say that again, because that's so powerful. And that was something that I had pulled out of the notes, right? That the opposite of depression is not happiness.
right, it's motivation.
Yeah.
And I think we equate, depression and happiness. You're either depressed or you're happy. And, depression zaps a person of their ability to do even the most basic things. And that was what he struggled with day in and day out. And, the other thing that I want people to understand about mental illness is he tried umpteen antidepressants. A doctor one time told us that trying to find a medication to treat depression is like trying on shoes without knowing your size. So it's very much trial and error. And, it's not like an Advil. It's not like you take an ibuprofen and it goes away. It takes time for the antidepressant to get into your system and to reach a therapeutic level. And so, all of the different medications that he tried, that was just a very frustrating exercise for him, to try a new one, thinking it would work, hoping it would help, only to find that it didn't.
Well, yeah, and and I think it's important to note because, I suffered from some general anxiety when I was younger and I went through the whole, the trial and error of the different, and and in talking to people, like the different medications they do. I mean, we're talking weeks worth of time to see if they're going to help, only to have them have some like really devastating side effects, some of them. And then you have to wean back off of it and then wean, and then like go back on and wait for that. I mean, so it is a big, serious process that, doesn't always work.
Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the side effects because there was one medication, and he was on a cocktail of medications because he had to take medications to try to control his seizures, as well as the depressants, and some, as needed anti-anxiety meds. But at one point it was like overnight, he gained 50 pounds. And so, here's this young guy. He has, major depressive disorder. He has epilepsy, and now he's overweight, and through no fault of his own. And that again
Right.
was just such a serious blow to his self-esteem. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the side effects, because
Oh
they're
yeah, and I think it's
real.
useful to note too that, it's different because now everybody's on everybody's on an antidepressant these days. And there is a difference between taking an antidepressant because you're feeling a little bit low or because you maybe have been through something, situational,
Yeah,
and having the mental illness of depression where you can't function, you can't get out of bed.
yeah.
And I think sometimes people don't really understand the difference. I mean, and to be honest, I don't even completely understand it. But I know that it is intense.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of times, excuse me, depression is a result of a chemical imbalance of the brain, just like physical illnesses are often physiological in nature. And so, and the fact that we treat mental illness so differently than physical illness, it's just something that needs to change. Just as an example, when we would tell people about Max's struggles with mental illness, people would say, well, what does he have to be depressed about? As if it was all, situational. But then when we would tell them about his epilepsy, we would get a much more compassionate and empathetic response. So we just need to stop treating mental illness like it's a mood, a passing mood, a crisis of faith, a character flaw, a behavioral problem. It's an illness, just like diabetes or heart disease.
Right. You sent me this beautiful slide that does a comparison between mental illness versus physical illness and how people respond to those differently. I mean, it's remarkable how in a physical illness, people come to you and they say, well, how can I help? What can I bring you? What can I do? Right. But then with a mental illness, like, what's wrong with you? You should just get over it. Like, just be happy. It's
We have
so
a long way.
unfair.
Yeah, it's unfair. We have a long way to go. We really do.
Mhm.
And the other thing that I think we understand that our physical health is impacted by a variety of factors, by, genetics, by environmental factors, by lifestyle choices. And the same is true of mental health. But for some reason, we forget that. We don't treat it as such. And so, I think that's something that needs to change in the way that we view and talk about mental illness as well.
And I'd like to think that it is changing. I think there's still ways to go, and I love that we're doing conversations like this because I think it does help. But I'd like to think that we're going in the right direction when it comes to that.
Yeah.
I really do. You mentioned in the book, and this was just so impactful to me. You mentioned that, suicide is not selfish,
Mm.
that people are easy and quick to judge. I think you said a friend said, how could he do that to you as his mother?
Mhm.
And it just kind of showed that she doesn't understand suicide and why it happens. And you pointed out very succinctly in the book that people do not commit suicide, they die by suicide. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. I didn't know that terminology until after he passed, but it makes so much sense. The word commit is often used to describe illegal or immoral behavior, committed adultery, committed murder, committed robbery. And so it brings with this very negative connotation and almost I don't even know, kind of like this sense that it's their fault. It's
Hmm.
their fault that they die this way. And statistics show, first of all, that suicide is the result of also a complex set of factors. It's never just one thing. And when people make the decision, and I even hate to say that phrase, but when they take their lives, they're not in their right frame of mind. And so, to say that they, committed as if it's premeditated and, and carefully thought out and well rationalized and reasoned is just not accurate. So the terminology is really important. We would never say somebody committed a heart attack.
Right.
And so, we really do. I say died by suicide. Some people say it was a victim of suicide
Mhm.
because they really are. And it's a tragedy. It's not illegal or immoral. It's a tragedy, and people really shouldn't judge it.
Yeah, and I used to think, right, when I didn't know before, I've talked to a lot of folks who have been, the victims of having someone die by suicide, and having to go through the grief of that. Um, I get the sense that dying by suicide isn't really a choice, that there isn't really the choice there, that the fact that it's happened, and tell me if I say this incorrectly, right? Because it's because they didn't see that there was any other choice.
Yeah.
And that's what the tragedy and the thing that just, it hurts my heart for everyone involved, for them and for the people around them.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true, Catherine. And we got a note from Max. He left us a note, and in some ways that has been helpful. In some ways, it has been very difficult. But that's what he said in his note. Is that he said, "I feel like I'm in a burning building, and the only thing to do is jump."
Oh,
And it reminded me of the 9/11 situation where people in the Twin Towers were jumping because the room that they were in was thousands of degrees, and and they really didn't have a choice, and they
yeah.
were just trying to escape. And I think the same is true of suicide. Often it's that they don't necessarily want to die, they just want the pain to stop.
Right,
And that's,
right.
as his mom, my gosh, is that hard to read and to hear and to understand and to try to wrap my head around. Um, and if anybody had said to me, people kind of did, he's in a better place.
Mm.
I didn't want to hear that, but I can say now, 4.5 years later, I am so glad he's no longer suffering, because he struggled and suffered and dealt with such darkness day in and day out. And I'm just so thankful that he doesn't have to deal with that anymore.
Mhm.
And, that might sound weird for me to say, but
Oh, I don't think so at all. I don't think so at all. And especially given that you do have faith, right? And like I do in terms of, I believe that I will see my son again, that it's not if, it's when and how long that's going to be. And I love how you share in the book that, it's one day closer to seeing him. And I had never thought of that, and that brought tears to my eyes. Not saying that I want to end, right? And that my life will go on, but the fact that, yeah, as we get older, we're getting closer to seeing them again. Um, and that's very touching.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I remember the first time I heard that phrase, I thought, oh gosh, that's morbid. But
But I get it.
yeah, I do. It took me a couple of times, and then to think about it instead of, because we focus on the first it's the days, then it's the months, then it's the years since we lost them. And instead of saying, honey, I'm one day closer to seeing you, and I can't wait to hold your beautiful face in my hands and kiss you. So,
Hmm.
that I do think it does bring a level of comfort.
Yeah, yeah. And so this was not easy on your faith going through all of this. And I really connected to that because I personally grew up Catholic. And when my baby died, I had my own spiritual crises, right? Because you ask, like, how does this happen? Why does this happen at all? And why does it happen to me?
Mhm.
Um, and then you also commented in there, and I had never thought of this myself, right? But in terms of why, if we believe in miracles and God can do all things, why did he not heal Max?
Mhm.
And I thought that was just like so powerful, and maintaining faith through that. I'm sure it wasn't easy.
No, it wasn't. So I think part of the reason that I had such a crisis of faith following Max's death is because I didn't expect him to die. And that might sound, naive and short-sighted, but he struggled pretty seriously for about 6 years, and he just got sicker and sicker over those years. Um, But, throughout that time, I prayed for him every day. And we had prayer gatherings at our house. He was on the prayer lists of many people. And I really felt like he was going to get better. I felt like he was going to be healed. And gosh, I've told this story a million times, but I remember walking, I still remember exactly where I was in my neighborhood. I remember walking and praying and hearing the Lord, not audibly, but in my heart, hearing the Lord say, he's going to be okay. And so of course I
Mm,
thought that meant he was going to be okay here. And so
right.
when he died, I thought, this is not the way this was supposed to go. And so I was completely blindsided by it, even though he had been hospitalized for suicide ideation numerous times. And so, I was so angry. I felt so betrayed. I felt so abandoned. And I'm really grateful that from the beginning, our pastors at our church said, God can take whatever you throw at him.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, he can take your anger, he can take your doubts, he can take your apathy, he can take it all. So I kind of let him have it. I really did. And I remember I would wake up in the middle of the night, and I would in my head, I would like be screaming at God, like, why? Why did you take my son? I thought you were going to heal him. He was going to have a tremendous testimony and give glory to you. Like, why didn't you use him in that way here on this earth?
Yeah.
And it took me a long time to really kind of come to grips with that. Over the
An
course.
answer? Did you get an
Sorry?
answer? I said, did you get an answer to that question?
No, no, not really. The book chronicles the 18 months after Max's death, and it wasn't until well after a year that I started to kind of regain my hope. And at that point, I was able to look back and say, God, you didn't abandon me. You've been there all along. And then see all of the provision that he had put in place. Like just as an example, I had a therapist that I was seeing prior to losing Max, and she has been a lifesaver. And so that was God's provision. My husband and I had a
Mm,
marriage counselor that we continued to see after we lost Max. We still see him periodically. And that has been God's provision. And just all of the people that God has placed in our lives, it's undeniable. All of these God
mm.
moments that I have had that, I was finally able to get to a place where I said, God, you didn't abandon me. You were with me all along. I just didn't want to see it. Um, and so, I still don't have, answers to the why. I won't have those until I go and join Max. But it is undeniable to me that God has been with me throughout and just kind of waiting for me patiently to get over my anger and,
Mm.
to come back to him. And, isn't that the picture of Jesus? That
Yeah.
just patient, loving kindness that he extends to us. So,
Yeah. I definitely came to the realization that sometimes there are no answers
mhm,
to the questions that we ask. Um, but what I do love, right, is that what does come out of so much of this, of the loss and the devastation, right, is the connections that we do get to have, right? Like I would never have met you. We wouldn't be able to do this, right? And it brings so much meaning and purpose to my life now. Not that I would, I would wish this on anyone for sure. But one thing that you said too was that parenting is perhaps the best way to understand God.
mhm,
And I believe that. I believe that because being a parent in general changes you, but then losing a child, it is, it was interesting. You wrote in your book, like, no, this is the worst, right? Like losing your child is really the worst kind of grief. And, we're taught to say we don't compare our grief and, and no one person's work, the grief that's the worst is the one that you have.
right.
But when you said that in the book, I'm like, I get it. I get it.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've lost other people, but it's
Yeah.
not the same.
No, well, so we lost Max 4.5 years ago, and a year ago, this past November, we lost my mom. She was 85 years old. And I can say with 100% certainty that my grief related to my mother's death is nothing compared to my grief related to Max's death. It's almost like it's just a completely different thing. And the other thing about grief is that I can't think about my mom's death and the grief that I feel without it tapping into Max's death. Grief begets grief, and it taps into all of the grief that you've had before. And so, I have this conversation with my therapist pretty regularly, have I grieved my mom? I don't know, but it's hard for me to just, okay, now I'm going to sit down, I'm going to grieve my mom without Max coming into it. That's just the way that it works. So yeah, I do think, child loss is just so incredibly difficult because it's out of order and we don't expect to bury a child. It's not common. It used to be far more common to lose a child than it is now. So you just feel really alone. And I just had this conversation with a woman yesterday, and we were talking about how so many people, so many other moms in particular, treat us as if if they come into contact with us, their child's going to die too. Like it's contagious.
Like it's contagious.
Yeah, like death of a child is contagious. And it's just it's so
Is it that, or is it because being in the presence of you, knowing that you have lost your child, evokes the feelings in them that they don't want to feel, to say, right? Because you mentioned in the book, like people say it all the time, like, I can't imagine. And you're like, well, yes, you can. Because you have a child. So imagine that child dying, like it's like that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, and I think that makes everybody uncomfortable. I mean, I think there's a difference. I mean, I think in general, people are uncomfortable with death and grief to begin with. When it's children, it takes it to another level.
Totally.
For
Yeah.
sure, for
Yeah.
sure.
Mm-hmm.
So what advice, so there were some things that you did that you found that were helpful that you outlined in the book. What were the things that you think helped you the most these past 4.5 years?
Well, I think it varied, based upon the time frame. So, at first the journaling really helped. We also installed, excuse me, a memorial garden in our property because, oftentimes after somebody dies, people give you a tree or a plant and so we got a bench and a plaque and a big memorial stone. So we created this garden. So I was able to, to kind of do that with some of my grief. I walked miles and miles and miles that summer that he died because it was just a way to, kind of move my body and not have my mind so fixated. You seeing a therapist. I started on an antidepressant myself. I needed medication, seeing our marriage counselor. But I would say that, and all of that was helpful. We also had tremendous support from friends and family, our faith community. But I think a really pivotal moment for me was when we joined our suicide survivor support group. And, it was a little over a year after Max died. And I think that whole first year I was thinking, if I can just make it to a year, I'll feel better. And then when that year came and went, and I thought, oh my gosh, not only do I not feel better, in some ways I feel worse.
Right.
Because that first year you're getting through all of the firsts, the first birthdays, the first holidays, that first anniversary. And, you're kind of like white knuckling it through those. And then at the beginning of the second year, you're just facing down forever. I am forever going to celebrate his birthday without him. I am forever going to celebrate Mother's Day without him. We are forever going to celebrate Christmas without him. And so when we joined a suicide survivor support group, I finally felt like I had found my people, because as well-meaning and as supportive as all of the people in our lives were, they didn't understand because they hadn't lost a child. I had one friend who had lost a child, and she was very helpful. But to sit in a with a group of people who, no matter what we said, would nod their heads was so validating. And
Mm,
it just helped to normalize our experience and make us feel less alone. Because, and you've probably learned this too, everybody who's grieving feels alone, feels like
mm,
nobody understands, nobody has been through what they've been through, and feels like they're doing it wrong.
mm,
And so to be with a group of people who understood our loss was huge. And so that was really pivotal. And then,
mhm,
the other thing that has helped me is, after my book came out, I started to connect with, people all over, really all over the world. So some moms had kids who struggled with mental illness, and I connected with them through that. Some parents had children who they had lost, so I connected with them about that. And I just felt like I needed some additional tools in my toolbox. So I became a certified grief educator. And so for the last couple of years, I have been offering these short-term online grief groups for bereaved parents. And that has also been incredibly healing for me
mm.
because I now have this incredible network of other moms who have lost kids who totally understand anything that I say or think or feel. And that really has just been a pivotal part of my healing too. Coming alongside them and trying to help them understand that they can survive the loss of a child has been very gratifying and healing for me. So I think,
Yeah, absolutely. I've noticed exactly the same thing, right? You set out because you know the pain that other people are experiencing, right? And you've survived that pain. And so I personally felt obligated to share and to be in the space, right? And to help because this is something that I can do because so much about loss and grief is this feeling of helplessness, right? Because you can and so not being in control of anything. And so for me, it was a sense of control. And yeah, and I have found that, if you're looking for the meaning of life, right, in all of this, the thing that I personally found was that it is in that connection. And I
yeah,
found that in my groups, yeah, that it's that connection that is the thing that's most valuable. Um, and I personally try to really focus, like I love the targeted groups in terms of, being with people who have lost sons or daughters to suicide. Um, but the thing that always sort of comes back for me is that there are similarities in grief across all different types of loss. And there are nuances, absolutely. But there is also so much that we can all sort of learn from and share because it is part of the human experience and because we all are going to die one day.
yeah,
Um, but
yeah,
I like your messaging at the end that you said, that we can all survive. We can live with that joy and the pain sort of intermingled at the same time. It's messy and it's a painful journey, is what you said in your book. But we
yeah.
can do it.
It took me such a long time to realize that. I don't know whether it's cultural, but like, this obsession we have with happiness. And so we think I'm either happy or sad, I'm
Right.
either lucky or, unfortunate. And they can all be true together. And it took me a really long time to realize that.
Mhm.
And I'm grateful for the lesson that I now know, but kind of part of me scratches my head and thinks, why did it take me so long to truly understand that life is both joy and pain?
Mhm.
That's just the way it is. And we don't have to be an either or, we can experience both at the same time.
Yes. And I think that is like in all the people that I've talked to on their grief journeys, I think that's a thing that really is some of the most surprising. We even I'll tell you, we did a thing in one of my groups. I've been trying to come up for that word, the word that combines pain and joy and what that emotion is at the same time, because there isn't a word for it.
Mm,
One of my clients, she calls it gratisad.
oh,
So
that's
being
great.
being grateful and being sad, and you can have those emotions, like you can be really, really sad, but also grateful.
Yeah.
And so that's the one word we've come up with so far.
Ratisat, I like it.
Gratis. I know I should what do you call it? Trademark it.
Yes, you should. You should get it in the
This
get it in the dictionary quick.
Yes, yes. But no, but this is so good. Anything else that you want to make sure that people know, right? Because what I love about what you're doing is you're on a mission, and you really want to help further the cause around mental illness and making sure that people are talking about it. What else do you want people to know, or what's the takeaway that you want them to take away from this?
Well, you're right. I want to normalize the conversation around mental illness, suicide, loss, and grief. And, I guess the thing, I can't really coalesce it into one thing, but like if I were speaking to a mom who has recently lost a child, I think what I would want her to know is that she can survive this. And at the beginning, I think that is so foreign. You cannot imagine surviving the death of a beloved child. And I think in some cases, you don't even want to.
Mm.
We often hear that dreaded "you're so strong" comment, right?
Yeah, I
And
don't want to be strong.
right. And I would say, like, no, I'm not. I'm just surviving. Like, I wasn't given a choice, and I
Mm.
just keep waking up every day. And so I would want a mom to know that she can survive it. It's hard. It's likely the hardest thing that she'll ever experience. But it's possible. And the other thing is that it takes work, because that old adage, time heals all wounds. No, it doesn't. Not
Bullshit.
yeah, amen. Not the loss of a child. You gotta work. You have to work, because you know, I I know, so not personally, but I've heard of so many moms who 5, 10, 15 years later, it's like they lost their child yesterday. And I get that. Gosh, I get that. But, we have to do the work. We have to process our grief. We have to find meaning in our lives, because I think that's what's honoring to our child. We feel at the beginning like the pain and the person are one and the same, the grief and the person. And if we let go of the pain, then we let go of the person. But that's not true. We can hang on to our child. I can hang on to my Max. I can talk about him every day, and I can also honor him by living my life fully. And I want other moms to know that they can do that too. So
Oh my goodness. Okay, that's like a mic drop right there. Right? Like mic drop, we're done. I mean, because that's exactly, you said in the book, like, I want to honor Max. And you've done that here, and you do that with the way that you're living, and you've done that with the book. So all of you guys, I am going to drop a link to the book so that you can find that. Where can people go to find out more about you specifically?
probably the best place is my website. It's erinblechman.com, and it has information about my book. It has information about my community talks that I do. It has information about my grief groups, and it has links to all of my social media as well. So that's
Perfect.
probably the best place.
Okay, so I will make sure that that gets listed here, and that we can do that. And yeah, so I invite you guys all to reach out to Erin and to ask her your questions, because I know you've been very open in talking about Max and your situation and everything that you've been through. And that is such a blessing, to everyone who's grieving, and to all of those who aren't yet, but will be one day.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it, Catherine. Glad to be connected to you.